I'm Ron Harmon. This is tomorrow's Church of God. I'd like to do a study today in Psalms 81 if everybody would like to turn there with me. I think it's a very good study. It's one worthy of going through, one that we can learn a lot out of. It goes on to say, let's just turn to Psalms 81 and go ahead and turn to it. In Psalms 81 it says, "Sing aloud to God our strength, and make a joyful shout to God of Jacob. Raise a song and strike the timbrel, the pleasant harp with the lute. Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon." And that's something we could talk about at another time, because I think that's very important. "At the full moon and on our solemn feast days. For this is a statute for Israel." Now, who is Israel? A lot of people like to say, well, it's that old Jewish state over there in Israel and in the land of Israel today, but this is not who God's talking about. It was a physical nation then, but Israel today is God's people. And we call it a spiritual Israel. That may or may not be the correct terminology. I believe it's okay. But there is a spiritual Israel that God talks about in the Scriptures. And that's who His people are today, not a physical people. Well, and it says, it's a statute for Israel. And if we keep going, it says, a law of the God of Jacob. Well, what is the law of the God of Jacob? Now, stop and consider what he's saying here in Psalms 81. He's saying this is a law of the God of Jacob. Well, this is prior to the Exodus. This is prior to the Israelites coming out of Egypt when it talks about the law of Jacob. So there has to be a law. A law is a law. What is a law in the Bible? We learn in 1 John 3. The law in the Bible is a transgression, or sin is a transgression of the law. So there is a law and there is a penalty to law. So is this a law of God? And what is the law of God at the time of Jacob? So you have to ask yourself that question. When it talks about law, Jacob had a law that he was adhering to, and we know he believed in the eternal. So it has to be a law that has a spiritual aspect to it. Well, verse 5 says, Then this he established in Joseph as a testimony. So this law was passed on to his son who was given a prophecy that his brothers would bow down to him. The whole nation of Israel basically would bow down to him at one time or in the future. And so this is part of Joseph's testimony, is this law that he has. And I believe it's the entire structure, the entire law of God. And I believe God gave it to Abraham, He gave it to Isaac, and He gave it to Jacob. And Jacob passed it on to Joseph and his sons, Reuben, all those. Whether they adhered to them or not is another Bible study. But what does this testimony mean? What testimony did Joseph take with him into Israel? What law did he take? Egypt. What law did he take with him into Egypt? Well, a testimony is a declaration of truth or fact. It's evidence given by a witness orally in court, or an oath or an affirmation, evidence to testify to something. And it's something to that effect. Old Testament, for example, the Ten Commandments as inscribed in 2 tablets of stone, well, that's a testimony. The Ark of the Covenant as a receptacle of these, that was a testimony in itself. So in Exodus 25:16, it says, it talks about Joseph, who Joseph was, and the meaning of Joseph. The word means God adds, and as we go through the history of Joseph, we learn that he was the 11th son of Jacob, and the older sons of 2 sons of Rachel. And we can see that in Genesis 30 and 24. And he's called the beloved son of Jacob, and we can find that in Genesis 37, 1 through 4. Question, what can we learn about Joseph from Genesis 37 in addition to that? Joseph was 17 years old when he was taken into captivity, and he was a shepherd. And we also know that he didn't participate in his brother's conduct. In fact, he brought the reports of their mischievous deeds to his father Jacob, and the resulting results of that, I should say, was his brothers becoming very angry at him and displeased with him. And the fact that Jacob loved him more than all his other brothers just didn't help any either. And then Jacob makes a coat of many colors for him, and his brothers just hated him altogether for this reason and all the others. And they just didn't seem to be able to talk to him because he was telling them about these dreams where they were going to have to bow down to him and stuff. And he was you might say he was rather naive to tell his dreams to his brother about his future supremacy over his brother and their submission to him. And so that intensified even more their hatred toward him. So when the opportunity came at Dothan, they planned to kill him, but Reuben steps in, the story is, and he tried to rescue him by persuading them not to kill him. Now, it turned around that they saw this caravan off in the future, and the brothers contrived to sell him to this caravan of Ishmaelites going to Egypt. And from that moment on, his life was changed from being the beloved son of Jacob to a slave to an unknown people in Egypt. Joseph was actually sold to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And he stayed in Potiphar's house. And in Genesis 39, 1 through 20, we can see that. Well, what can we learn about what kind of person he became in Egypt? Well, he took this testimony with him in the law of Jacob. So, based on that, he became a very good administrator for Potiphar. He was hardworking, he was a faithful servant, he was fair and handsome. And in Genesis 39:6, it says, God was with him and made him prosper and successful. God blessed his master through him. So Potiphar, the captain of the guard of the Pharaoh, was blessed through the very fact that he owned Joseph, and Joseph was an administrator in his home. And so that's an intriguing scripture right there, that somebody who owns us or somebody who's over us could be blessed because of our adherence to God and his ways. And what does it mean to be blessed? In Psalms 1, it says, and you may recognize it's part of a Psalms, it says, blessed is a man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the paths of sinners, nor sits in the seats of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree is planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruits in season, whose leaf always shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. Now Potiphar, his master, had entrusted him with the charge of all of his household affairs, and became blessed. Became very blessed. So that's very important to understand what it means to be blessed by God in that way, even as a Gentile or somebody that's not part of God's truth. Now, there was a temptation of Joseph in Potiphar's house. Joseph was apparently very young and handsome, as it says, and as I said, he was head of the house, so he was very important. And when the temptation came in the form of Potiphar's wife, and nobody would have known if he had given in to the temptation by Potiphar's wife, but he would have known, because he had a healthy fear of God and he had a conscience, and he just did not want to defile that trust. And so he makes the statement, he says, no one is greater in the house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, and he's talking to the wife, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Now, this was a period of time, and it was fairly long. It was going on for a while, and he tried to resist her as much as he could, but when the time came, he had to flee from it because she was just overpowering, apparently. So, how to overcome temptation and the temptation of Christ? We can kind of look at an example that Joseph gives us here. Well, due to the false accusations of Potiphar's wife, he was cast into prison, Genesis 39:20. And once again, he paid the price. And I shouldn't have said, let me back up, shouldn't have said the temptation of Christ. It was being tempted in the way Christ was. And in the way Joseph was, and how we are to act in Christ's presence. Let me just clarify that. So Joseph, he gets cast into prison. We see that in verse 20 and in 41:37. And once again, God was with him in all his trials and tribulations. And but God did not rescue him from these trials and tribulations. He let him go through with this because it was God's plan, and he had a higher purpose for Joseph. And we may not always see the immediate thing that God has for each and every one of us, but God knows what our future is. He knows what He has planned out for us. So Joseph continued to be faithful, and the Lord again blessed him in all his work, and the jailer gave him charge over all the other prisoners in the prison, and he helped the chief butler, cupbearer, to restore his position in the Pharaoh's office. But and there was a promise made, but the cupbearer forgot his promise to mention about Joseph's innocence to the Pharaoh. After 2 years, when the Pharaoh had a couple of dreams about these fat and lean cows and different things, and he couldn't make heads or tails out of them, and neither could his administrators, the cupbearer kind of overheard this, and he remembered Joseph and his skills to interpret dreams. So when Joseph was brought to the Pharaoh, he interpreted the dream about the 7 years of plenty, followed by the 7 years of famine, and he suggested the preparation for the famine by storing food during the good harvest years. And so Joseph, the chief became the chief minister or governor of Egypt, and through this, and the Pharaoh liked his proposal, and he made Joseph the head of the state to implement his plans of upcoming famine. He was given an Egyptian name and was married to an Egyptian priest's daughter. Now let's back up here and let's look at this just a little bit. He was married to the Egyptian priest's daughter. What was the Egyptian priest? The Egyptian priest at that time was a priest to Ra, or one of the other lesser gods, but most likely, if he was that important of a person, he was a priest of the head god, which was Ra, Amun-Ra. And so Joseph married the daughter of the chief priest of the gods of Israel. That's pretty significant, isn't it? We kind of gloss over these kind of things sometimes, and there's some other things that we're going to get into during this that we're going to look at that are equally confounding and a little bit baffling when you stop and consider what's going on in light of today's world. So what God was he priest of? My guess is it was Amun-Ra. He was 30 years old. Joseph was 30 years old after this time, so this is 13 years after he was put into captivity by his brothers. So God had made him one of the most influential persons in all the world at that time. Because stop and consider what Egypt was at that time. At the time Joseph and his brothers and his father went into Egypt at that time. Egypt was the America, the United States of today. It was the superpower of its time. It was the greatest nation of its time, And there was other nations around and stuff, just like there's others around us today. But Egypt had the cultural center, it had the education center, it had all the fine arts, it had everything that you can think of at that time. And this is what he became the chief administrator over, to second in the kingdom to the Pharaoh. His wisdom and planning saved the lives from not only all those in Egypt, but many other nations. Joseph's life was a very unusual thing, and his family reunion was very unusual in that fact, because God brought them back together. The famine brought his brothers and his fathers into Egypt, and a reunification of the family. Now, they didn't recognize him. They didn't even understand him because he spoke Egyptian. He remembered the dream that he had when he was a young boy, and how the dream said that his brothers would submit to him. And so his brother started testing so Joseph started testing his brother in different ways, and finally made himself known to them. And he forgave them and persuaded them to settle in Egypt with their father Jacob during the time of the famine. Now Joseph lived 110 years old. Now he was 30 years old. Let me back up. He was 17 years old when he went into Egypt. So he was, roughly in Egypt for, 93 years? And then he was administrator, second over Egypt, for 80 years. He had a lot of influence in that land for a long period of time, for 8 decades. Now it says, there's a key verse that says, the Lord was with Joseph, the Eternal was with Joseph. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. It says that in in Genesis 50, verse 20. Joseph in the Bible is a type of Christ. The Old Testament often represents many symbols and metaphors and characters which points to the life of Christ and God's plan of salvation. These are called type of Christ. And there's Moses, there's Noah, and there's others, even including Abraham, Joseph's great-grandfather. So we'll continue in verse 5 of Psalms 81. That was just a brief history of Joseph, so we kind of understand where we're going. So in verse 5, it says, when he went through the land of Egypt, where I heard a language that I did not understand. So when Joseph entered into the land of Egypt, he didn't speak the language any more than his brothers did. It was totally foreign to him. He had to learn the language. Well, one has to ask, what language existed then? Was it Hebrew? Did they speak Hebrew? Well, that's a little bit deceiving whenever you stop and think about it. I know a lot of people like to say that there was a pure Hebrew language before they went into Egypt, but there's no evidence of that. So what languages existed then? The native writing systems of ancient Egypt used to record the Egyptian language include both the Egyptian hieroglyphs and a hieratic from the Photo-Dynastic times, the 13th century BC, which is a cursive form, variants of the hieroglyphics, which became popular. Then the latest demonic script, developed from the hieratic from 3500 BC onward, the Egyptians began to form a pictographic written language about 5,000 years ago, which they continued to use for more than 3,500 years until about 400 AD. Eventually, the pictures they used to represent words became representative sounds. These symbols and hieroglyphs and sacred inscriptions were adapted for use in everyday life in addition to their important religious and mystical identities. Now, Egyptian and Semitic languages fall under the Asiatic language group, and both the Semitic, Arabic, and Hebrew and Egyptian cultures developed within the same region, within that same area, within a very, very close of each other, which was the eastern horn of Africa. All these cultures assimilated and interchanged cultural idioms. What language did Abraham speak when he left the land of Ur? Was it a pure form of Hebrew? The Hebrew language didn't exist until Israel left Egypt. That's the only Hebrew language we know. Now, this is my input. This is from Ron 101. The Hebrew language is a combination of language, including Egyptian. And when we read in the biblical Anthropology by Alice C. Lindsay, we look this up online, and you can look this up online. What language did Abraham speak? Just type that in. And she says this. Let me read this. The best evidence to the date suggests that Abraham and his Hebrew ancestors spoke the languages of the people among whom they lived. As rulers of the Afro-Asiatic dominion, Abraham's ancestors spoke a Nilo-Saharan languages, some of which are now extinct, like Sumerian. Two of these special interests, Sarah and Huro, both connected with Abraham's Nilo-Saharan ancestors who worshipped Ra and Horus. Now, this again is my input. It could have been Samaritan, or not Samaritan, but Sumerian. But I didn't write what she wrote. She wrote it. So let's continue down this article a little bit. And it supplies clues to the, and she goes on to say, this supplies clues as to the language spoken by Abraham and his Hebrew ancestors. It was a Cushitic language that resembled the Old Arabic Dinante, and it is older than Hebrew, Armenian, and Akkadian. It is, it tended to use two consonant roots. Hebrew, on the other hand, tends to use three consonant roots. Arabic is closer to the Cushitic or the Proto-Saharan languages of Abraham's people, as evidenced by the higher numerical frequency of two consonant roots. Hebrew is largely triconsonantal, and as with the Old Arabic, has no vowels. This is why the word may appear with various spellings, her, hor, har, and the root is hr, and because it is biconsonantal, we know that this root is older than the Hebrew language. The Egyptian language has no vowels either, so to say that you can trace something back to Abraham is tantamount to saying you're tracing it back to a language that has Samaritan, Egyptian, or Arabic roots. So, and stop and consider this also. How in the world can you say a language came into existence within 3 generations? That's from Abraham to Jacob, because remember, Joseph was only 17 years old when he went into captivity, so it would have taken those 3 generations for Hebrew, the language of the Hebrews, to develop. How could that be? Now, the total time from the time Abraham left Ur until Joseph and Jacob and went into Egypt was 220 years. That is the total time. So how could a language just appear during that time? And better yet, how can you claim it is a pure language, or it is a more pure Hebrew language than the one they came out of Egypt with? Now, it's important to understand that, because a lot of people make the assumptions that you're tracing words back to prior to the Israelites going into captivity into a different language, which is more pure Hebrew. That just isn't a fact. You can't make that assumption. Common sense says it didn't. A language like that couldn't have developed over that time, especially to that degree. And even the experts say it didn't. And the very fact that the Egyptian written language and the Hebrew language, neither one has vowels. They read the same, right to left, up and down. They are identical in so many ways. Now, are they specifically just the Egyptian and some other language that developed into the Hebrew? I believe it was godly inspired. I don't have any problem with that, but I also believe it was a combination of other languages, especially the ones that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob spoke prior to going into Egypt, which wasn't Hebrew. It was a Semitic language. All right, let's keep going. That's enough of that. Psalms 81, verse 6. I removed his shoulder from the burden. His hands were freed from the basket. You called in trouble, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you to the waters of Meribah. And he's talking about the people of Israel. He says, Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you. O Israel, if you will listen to me, there shall be no foreign god among you. No foreign god, nor shall you worship any foreign god. He tells us we're not to worship. We don't worship any foreign. And this is very important because Egypt at that time was worshiping every god under the sun. Each pharaoh had Amen attached to their name. A lot of times, Amenhotep and some of the others, because they were considered gods. Now we venerate a person today in our lands who we say is equal to God, or God's vicar on the earth. So how is this uncommon? It's not. And so he says you don't worship any other gods. And this is tantamount to telling a denomination in this world today, telling them you don't worship that guy. And it's very important. It also says in Deuteronomy 13:16, says they provoked him to jealousy with foreign gods, with abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons, not to God. To gods they did not know, to new gods, new arrivals, that your fathers did not fear. Of the rock who begot you, you are unmindful, and have forgotten the God who fathered you. Also, in this chapter of Hosea, it says this, Hosea 13:1-5. It says, when Ephraim spoke, and this is very important when we move into Hosea, because this takes us back into something I was talking about earlier, and I just kind of want to re-emphasize this. In Hosea 13:1-5, it says, when Ephraim spoke, trembling, there was a trembling. So he's very important. Now remember, who is Ephraim? Ephraim is the brother of Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh are part of the 12 tribes of Israel. But Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of the daughter of the high priestess in Egypt and Joseph. Yes, you got that right. They were half Egyptians. They were sons of the daughter of the high priestess in Egypt. Well, what gods did they worship? And it says, and Jacob went on to say, Joseph, your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were born in Egypt, but I accept them as my own, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. And any children you have later will be considered yours, but their inheritance will come from Ephraim. And it's interesting to know because Ephraim died because of the worship of Baal. It went on to say in Hosea. But he says, any children later will be considered yours, but their inheritance will come from Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim received the blessings from Jacob. Well, it's important to understand who Ephraim is today. I believe that is the United States. That is me. I believe it. You can take it however you wish. It's just my thought. Ephraim received the blessings from Jacob. This nation has been more blessed than any nation ever in history of the world. Why wouldn't this be Ephraim at end time? And he received all the blessings from Jacob, even though he was half Egyptian. This is interesting, because Jacob had other sons. He had other grandchildren. Why did he bless Ephraim and Manasseh? I have no idea. I have my own thoughts. I just don't choose to delve into them today. Well, these were the product of the Pharaoh's daughter, or the high chieftain's daughter, and Joseph at that time. And you have to ask yourself, what language did they speak? What language did they grow up learning in the Pharaoh's house? And because these people were the equivalent of living in the White House. It's important to understand these kind of things. Why are they included in the 12 tribes of Revelation? All right, let's continue on from the verse of 1 of Hosea chapter 5. It says, He exalted himself in Israel, but when he offended through Baal worship, he died. Now they sin more and more, and have made for themselves molten image, idols of their silver according to their skills, and all of it's the work of the craftsman. So Ephraim died as a result of worship of a golden calf. Well, what did Israel build out in, once they left Egypt, out in the wilderness of Sinai? They built golden calves when Moses stayed too long on top of Mount Sinai, and they wanted to worship those golden calves. Who brought us out of the land of Egypt? Well, he goes on to say, Who brought you out of the land of Egypt? Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people would not heed, and that we're back in Psalms, I'm sorry. In verse 11, but my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. Verse 12. So I gave them over to their own stubborn heart, to walk in their own counsels. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, verses 30-31, it says, Take care that you not be ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you. And he's talking about foreign gods. And that you do not inquire about those gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods? That I also may do the same. You shall not worship the eternal your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Eternal hates they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways, but they didn't walk in God's ways, not even the time of Jesus. They defiled the teachings of every prophet ever sent to them. They killed the prophets, as Jesus said. So, in the last days, in the very last days prior to Christ coming, it says, the Gentiles will seek God, but the physical people of the nation of Israel will have no answers. They're not going to be able to answer. Their beliefs are like Christianity, are based upon lies, like all the religions of the world. Jeremiah 16:19, it says, O Lord, my strength, my fortress, my refuge in the day of affliction. The Gentiles shall come to you from the ends of the earth and say, Surely our fathers have inherited lies, worthless and unprofitable things. And we have, time and time again. And they do it in the name of the Bible. They do it in the name of Jesus. They do it in the name of Israel, or whatever that they deem holy. They do it in that name, and they pervert it, change it to fit their way, their traditions, so that they can have their little idioms or their little ways of doing things. And he says, you don't do those things. He says you worship those things which are called gods that are not gods. And he says, therefore, verse 21, Behold, I will this once cause them to know that I cause them to know my hand and my might, and they shall know that my name is eternal. So, continued back in Psalms 81, in verse 14, he says, I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. Verse 15, I guess there's more verses, 16 too. The haters of the Eternal would pretend submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. So they pretend submission to God all the time, doing what their traditions dictate to them. Wow. He goes on to say, in verse 16, he would have fed them also with the finest of wheat and with honey from the rock, and I would have satisfied you. Our blessings would overflow if we truly followed God. So they pretended submission to God because they saw what happens if they went against God. Thousands of them died in the wilderness. You can look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through about 20 on that one, where it talks about how many people died by going against God in the desert and disobeying Him. So they pretend to do it. So if they're pretending to worship God in the desert while following Him in a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day, who are they praying to? Who is their God? Well, we saw how fast they built golden calves after Moses didn't come back down. And the golden calf is part of their ritual, part of their gods, part of Baal worship. So we have this vision that somehow Israel became pure and became and rid themselves while they were in the land of Sinai of all this paganism, and they were a pure people going over the Jericho, driving out the pagans before them, when that just isn't the case. What is the secret? Our blessings would overflow if we followed God. So what is the secret? What's the goal today? We see in Luke chapter 8, verse 17, he says, For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. So our duty is to look a little deeper. Our duty is to search these scriptures daily if we possibly can. Continue to dig deeper and find answers that are not obvious at first or second or third glance. We have to rethink what we were once taught. That's what our duty is, to look at religion as something other than just traditions. So I invite you to visit our website at thetcog.com. That's THETCOG.com. And what that stands for is thetomorrowchurchofgod.com. Well, till next time, God bless you and your families.